Would either of you name one positive thing that you respect in one another?
What's the purpose of the question? My father, no, let me finish. Let me finish.
Because I'm going to make a point and you're taking my time. So I will yield to any member who
because
deployed.
I'm offended at your suggestion that somehow if we've not served in a combat zone that we don't care about protecting the lives of our constituents.
Has nothing to do about how you
to me.
And for our family members who have lost blood.
The Glastonbury Board of Education special meeting to consider rescinding the high school mascot name change from Tomahawks to Guardians was adjourned after this exchange. Mark Finicaro was pushed by Board of Ed member Ray McFall, who was decked. Another resident said he was disappointed that a board member would push someone.
Good evening, friends, and welcome. My name is Bill Harmer. I'm the Executive Director of the Westport Library. I just want to start by saying thank you. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for showing up and supporting us in the launch of this important new initiative, Common Ground. Based on the clips we just viewed together, it's clear that returning civility to discourse is going to be a challenge for all of us. It doesn't just happen out there. It's also happening right here in Westport. However, I have faith in our community and faith that this Common Ground initiative and others in this community are going to get us there. The Common Ground initiative is the Westport Library's new forum for participating in public discourse on topical issues of importance to everyone in the community. Our goal for Common Ground is to share a light on key issues and create forums for public discourse and invite the community to engage in thoughtful civic discussion so that our democracy can survive and thrive. The mission is to change the current attitude from winning or losing arguments to making progress on solving problems that seem intractable by inspiring the community to work together and finding common ground that proves beneficial to all. As we find ourselves living in increasingly polarized times, it is critical that we, as a community, work towards building capacity and resilience in tackling challenging and controversial issues. This is where the public library enters the picture. It is the responsibility of the public library to serve as a convener for and facilitator of civic engagement and civil discourse. The public library's legacy is that all voices be heard and where respect is displayed for community members' opinions, thoughts, histories, religion, and culture. Democracy cannot thrive without civic discourse that recognizes the legitimacy of different points of view. Although the public library, the Westport Library, is playing a leadership role in launching and hosting this effort, it is being created and facilitated in conjunction with community members representing a wide array of constituents and ideological points of view. At the planning stages of this initiative, we felt strongly about inviting community members who represent different points of view. Why was that important? It is clear and simple. Because the shape of common ground must be determined from the outset through the representation of a variety of voices at the planning table. At this time, I'm going to ask our current Common Ground members to please stand up and be recognized. Thank you, and thank you to my colleagues on the committee. With regard to our inaugural event, our plan was to have a former Democratic senator appear with Mr. Roy Blunt, but scheduling issues led to us having to decide to move forward with Mr. Blunt alone. However, the mission of Common Ground remains solid. Our plan is to continue the conversation on civil discourse by bringing in a former Democratic senator in the near future, and we plan to make an announcement about that soon. I want to be clear, however, that Common Ground is not necessarily about having conversations with politicians. In fact, it's going to be an ongoing, comprehensive, long-term commitment with a variety of approaches, formats, guests, and opportunities for participation. Remember, tonight is just the beginning. We are going to grow and evolve Common Ground together from this point forward. In the near future, the library is going to create a landing page for the Common Ground Initiative where you can find information about our committee and opportunities for you to make suggestions and participate in the process. Moderating tonight's discussion with Senator Blunt is Westport's own Steve Parrish, who is also a member of the Common Ground Committee. As Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs, Altria Group Incorporated from 1995 until 2008, Steve Parrish was responsible for the corporation's government relations, communications, issues management, philanthropy, and compliance departments. In addition, he led the company's outreach to public health organizations, civic groups, the media, and government. He has appeared on numerous news and public affairs programs, including Meet the Press, Face the Nation, The Today Show, Nightline, and the NewsHour on PBS. For more than a decade, Steve worked with members of Congress from both parties, regulators, public health officials and organizations, and others in support of proposals to grant the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Administration authority to regulate the tobacco industry. His efforts were documented in network news broadcasts and national publications such as ABC's Peter Jennings reporting, a New York Times Magazine cover, and the national bestseller, A Question of Intent, by former FDA Commissioner David Kessler. After passing the landmark legislation granting the FDA regulatory authority over the tobacco industry, a 2009 New York Times article quoted Steve as congratulating Dr. Kessler. "Congratulations on the vote today. Truly historic, and it will save lives." To which Dr. Kessler replied, "Congratulations to you. You were key." Without delay, please welcome our friend, Steve Parrish.
Thank you, Bill, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight, which is the kickoff for what I think is going to be a really fantastic initiative. I'm very proud to be a member of the library's Common Ground Committee, but tonight I want to make it very clear that neither I nor Senator Blunt are speaking on behalf of the committee or on behalf of the library. We are speaking in our individual capacities. After Senator Blunt and I finish our conversation, there will be some time for questions from the audience. If you have a question, write it on the card you were given when you arrived and take it over to Bill Harmer and Jim Marpy over here. And then they will collect the questions and we'll ask them to Senator Blunt. If you don't have a card and you need one, raise your hand and somebody will get one to you. So, if you meet a partisan, never recognize the dividing lines, but meet on what common ground remains, if only that the sun shines and the rain rains for both. The area will widen very fast, and before you know it, the boundary mountains on which the eye had fastened have melted into air. That advice is even more relevant today than when Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote it in 1883. Our society seems to be characterized by polarization, tribalism, and hyperpartisanship. It seems that the default attitude on behalf of many is, surely you must agree with me, and if you don't agree with me, you're ignorant or stupid or evil or all of the above. These attitudes are not limited to politics and government. We see them in the public and private discourse regarding religion, education, child rearing, the environment, what books we should be allowed to read, and the list goes on. The purpose of the Common Ground Initiative is to examine these societal attitudes and explore how things might change for the better. Let's be clear, though. This initiative is not about getting everyone to agree on everything. It is not about deciding who is right and who is wrong. The Common Ground Initiative is not about the what, it is about the how. How do we work together to move forward as members of a civil society? How do we operate in ways that encourage respectful, constructive dialogue? How do we promote a culture that doesn't simply tolerate disagreements, but one that encourages passionate debate without destroying the opportunity to make positive, meaningful progress? How do we arrive at that day when, as Emerson would say, the boundary mountains on which our eyes have fastened have melted into air? Tonight's program is just the first step in what I hope will be an exciting and meaningful journey for our community, but it is just that, a first step. There is much more to come after tonight. More speakers, including, as Bill said, a Democratic senator, and I hope I'm not getting out in front of my friend Kirsten Gillibrand, but she told me yesterday she would be honored and happy to come and address us in this forum in a conversation about common ground and civil discourse. There'll be a variety of formats: one-on-one conversations, lectures, and panel discussion. In addition to politics and government, we hope to explore civil discourse and common ground as they relate to topics like education, religion, and the arts. And we won't only be focusing on the national level. We'll look at how all this relates to what goes on right here in Westport. Now, I know all that sounds very ambitious, but I believe that it can be done if we listen to each other as we go, building on what we learn about what the community wants. So, with all that in mind, I hope you will join me in welcoming former United States Senator Roy Blunt. Roy has devoted his life to public service as a teacher, a university president, a county elected official, a state elected official, a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, and a member of the United States Senate. In every position he has held, Roy has shown the value of listening to all stakeholders and to working with colleagues across the aisle in order to improve people's lives by getting things done.
I turn around and Roy Blunt is standing right next to me. And I said, I know you. And we gathered together again and really struck up a friendship. And then we both were on the House Agriculture Committee, and the very first bill I think either of us ever introduced was this very exciting bill about wheat germ. And so I often was asked, what was the first bill I ever introduced? And it was a wheat disease bill. But Roy and I got it done and went on to really form a wonderful friendship ever since. And I was very excited when he then joined us in the United States Senate.
One of the things that attracts me to Roy Blunt is his knowledge of history, and I know we can have a back and forth where I will learn something from him, presumably he'll learn something from me, and that helps you work together better. It makes things, when there is anger or disagreement, passionate disagreement, which can be angry sometimes, it helps you get in the right place when you have that sort of historical depth and knowledge. And I think it absolutely makes you a better legislator.
Our work on protecting election officials. Roy, having been a previous election official, understood that. We had a bipartisan hearing with the Secretary of States from red states and blue states. That was a major moment for me, but probably the thing I most remember was on January 6th, when we had started the morning with this beautiful celebration and this ceremony of this walk with the young women with the mahogany boxes. Everyone here knows exactly what I'm talking about. Insurrection went on, and Roy showed so much leadership that entire day in working with his colleagues, because while the police were on the front lines, as we recognize today, Roy was doing a lot of work in working out how the process was going to work once we got through there. You know, he was the guy that made that work late into the night.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Senator Roy Blunt. Roy, thank you very much for being here with us. We've got a packed house, so let's get right to it. I want to start with a little bit about your background, because I think it's relevant to what we're going to talk about later in terms of civil discourse and common ground. You're born in Webster County, Missouri. Now, I'm from Missouri. I don't know where the heck Webster County is. Is that in the Springfield area?
It is. It's right the county right next to Greene County, right next to Springfield. One of the smaller counties in the state. My mom and dad were dairy farmers. We actually lived in Greene County at that time, but we went across the county line. I was born at the doctor's office. I may be the last of a generation of people who weren't born in the hospital. My younger brother was born in the hospital, but I was born in the doctor's office at Niangua, Missouri, and for sure the only United States senator ever born in Niangua, Missouri, but it was a good start.
Absolutely. And you attended Southwest Baptist University. What was your major?
History and education, but history was my major. Minor in political science. I'm the first person in my family to graduate from college, and then later I actually went back to that university after I'd been Secretary of State and spent 4 years as president of the university I graduated from, and it was a great time. I've had so many great opportunities in my life, and all of them have involved working with people and bringing people together, and I was pleased to see my good friends from the Senate, who along with others had things to say about our effort to work together when I left the Senate. And so county government, I was a county clerk and chief election official in the biggest county, third biggest county in our state when I was 23. I was the first Republican elected Secretary of State in Missouri in 52 years. When I won that job, and the legislature at the time, there were twice as many Democrats as Republicans in the Missouri General Assembly. And then after 4 years at Southwest Baptist University, I ran for Congress and spent the next 26 years, half of it roughly in the House and half of it in the Senate, and was pleased to do that work every day. In many ways, Steve, I feel like I never went to work a day in my life because I loved what I did so much. And even when it was hard, there were still ways to get things done that other people had less success in finding, but nobody found it without help of people from the other side.
Roy, I remember that election when you were elected Secretary of State. In those days, Missouri was pretty much as blue a state as there was. And as you know, my family was very active in Democrat politics, so your election that night was a newsmaker in our house. So you spent 14 years in the House, and then 12 years in the Senate, retired this past November when you decided you were not going to stand for re-election. So,
technically in January, but yes.
Yeah, January,
right.
sorry.
So I served the rest of that term and January the 3rd was my last day, and I was there to walk down the aisle in the Senate with my replacement, the Attorney General of Missouri, Eric Schmidt, and the next day was excited about whatever comes next. And right there in the library, I will say I tend to be a next chapter guy, not a last chapter guy. And looking forward to that. But again, grateful for the opportunities I had. Glad to get chances to talk about them. I know it was mentioned by both you and the library director that there'd been hope at one point to have two of us on the stage. I would have been glad to do that. Senator Heidi Heitkamp from North Dakota, and I did an event in Chicago about a month ago at an event called the Crane Forum. And both of us spent a lot of time talking about the necessity in a democracy or in a working democratic institution of finding things to do together, of the lasting impact of things that you find to do together. And I look forward to keeping up as you have Senator Gillibrand in later. She and I did some work together, particularly related to military families, and we're able to get some legislation passed that made it much easier for families to move from one post to another, gave them much more flexibility than they'd ever had before about whether the family could, if necessary for job or school, move earlier to the next post or stay later at the post they were in. And, you know, the families are the backbone of the military, and it was a big step toward treating the importance of the family unit and decisions that they would make collectively. And that wouldn't have happened without Senator Gillibrand taking real responsibility to see that we got that done and got that particular obstacle moved out of the way of so many families. Many families leave the military, frankly, or have left the military because there was just no option to wait another couple of months or leave a couple of months early to do what was best for your family. And usually the next transfer didn't occur because those people weren't in the military often by the next transfer.
Camp. I had occasion to meet her when she was Attorney General, and an invitation to her to appear at one of our forums has been extended. So hopefully we'll see her in the near future. I want to talk a little bit about some of your experiences working with the people you saw in the video, but also a couple of other members of the Senate from the other side of the aisle. And I think I'm a big believer in the power of stories. And I think some of the stories that you can tell us about your work with Senator Klobuchar, Senator Stabenow, Senator Brown would really help inform our thinking about common ground, what it means, and why it's so important. So let me ask you to do that.
Well, first of all, I said in my farewell speech on the Senate floor, talking about the importance of working together, that to work with somebody, particularly somebody in an institution like the Senate, you don't have to agree with them on everything to get something done. You just have to agree with them on one thing to get something done. And I'll also say when that happens, both of the senators who are involved and their staffs begin to look for the second thing you can agree on. You know, Sherrod Brown and I were Secretaries of State together in 1985. That's how long we've known each other. Friends in this then and a little more friendly in the House, but in the Senate, we really became good friends over the last 12 years. I sometimes jokingly say that in the almost 40 years we've known each other, Sherrod Brown and I have agreed on exactly 5 things, and they're all federal law. You know, and they range from President Obama's Advanced Manufacturing Initiative that we were the 2 principal sponsors of, to information that has to be given to every woman who's having breast cancer surgery about all the options available to her, And often minority women and poor women were not told the options that were available to them until we changed the federal law. You know, we both began, there was a fairly, we had to go far and wide to find 5 things, but we found them. And then we worked together on some employment issues in the Senate. I was the chairman of the committee that was responsible for the daily operation of the Senate. Sherrod had a real heart for everybody who worked there, and we were able to solve some problems that way too. With Senator Klobuchar, we were 2 top party members on that daily operating committee. And we did lots of things together there. We did lots of things. We also chaired the adoption caucus. We chaired the travel and tourism caucus, all the economic implications of that caucus and visa implications. That led to lots of legislation over a dozen years. Senator Stabenow, she said the first bill we passed together in the House in 1997 was a bill that went through the Ag Committee. We had met a few years earlier when we were, JCs at that time had something called the 10 Outstanding Young Americans. And we both got it at the same time, 1985. It was the first year women were recognized in that group. And when we were elected to Congress, we were having our picture taken on the front steps of the Capitol. I'm standing behind Debbie, and she turned around just as she suggested she did on the floor and said, "Don't I know you?" And I said, "You absolutely do." We immediately remembered that weekend experience of being together for that recognition of things she had done as a legislator, things I'd already done as a local election official and as a new Secretary of State. But the greatest story there, we did some legislation on certified community behavioral health centers. And we went to the floor together the last week of October 2013, which was the 50th anniversary of the last bill President Kennedy signed into law, which was the Community Mental Health Act. And the Community Mental Health Act was designed to do essentially 2 things as we went through that 50-year-old law that day. One was to close the asylum-like institutions that weren't working well in almost every case, and the other was to replace them with high-quality, 24/7, 365-day-a-year certified community health centers. Well, the country did a great job in the rest of the 60s and the 70s of closing those facilities, but almost nobody did the work necessary, almost no community, no state, to replace those facilities with what had been envisioned in 1963. And so we actually had a bill that would begin to do that for any state that could meet the qualifications. Let me get through this story pretty quickly. We got a 10-state pilot of states that were going to do this. They were all finding that their other health care costs for people being served by those certified community health centers went down more than the investment of doing the right thing for mental health. And we had, by last year, we had 5 years from states ranging from New York to Oklahoma in size of the results they'd had of reduced emergency room use, different relationship with local police, reduced cost of other healthcare costs. And when we had this tragedy occur in Uvalde, Texas, Senator Stabenow and I immediately decided we're going to have a lot of discussion here about what do we need to do to make the mental health system work better. But we've got 5 years of experience with something we know works. We've got a financial structure that works to support it. Let's make this the principal mental health part of this package. And at the end of that package, the bill we voted on, the Safer Communities Act, has a pathway now for the other 40 states to do what 10 states have already done. So in 2023, I heard somebody from Health and Human Services talking about this the other day, and they said, here we are, 60 years after the country set this goal for itself, and we have a pathway to get it done. And that clearly would not have happened without incredible bipartisan effort or without the superb legislator that Senator Stabenow is.
So I get that you and Senator Brown had a relationship going back, I think you said, to 1985 when you were Secretary of State. You knew Senator Stabenow from your days before you were in the House. How do you go about, so obviously in those two cases, the personal relationship, the personal connection was there. How do you go about building that kind of a trust-based, respectful relationship from scratch with a new senator or a senator who you've never really dealt with?
Well, almost without exception, the 100 people that get to the United States Senate have a certain amount of skill of how to associate with other people. As you pointed out, my politics were in a state where the first thing you talked about wasn't your partisan affiliation, it was how you could do the job. Since nobody in my party had been elected statewide to that job in 52 years, the strongest foot forward would not have been vote for me because I'm a Republican, but vote for me because here's what I can do, and then you get the job and you prove it. But I think it was about 3 Congresses ago, there were 52 Republicans, 48 Democrats. My staff came to me one day and said, you do so many things with so many different members on the other side. We just thought we'd check and see how many of the 48 Democrats you'd been the principal sponsor, not just a co-sponsor, but the principal sponsor of a piece of legislation with, and the answer was 44. So not just 2 people that I'd had long-time relationship with, but finding 44 people. Chris Coons and I, every year worked to get, every time it expired, to get the Victims of Child Abuse Act extended. Senator Warner and I worked on a number of pieces of legislation together that dealt with the Intel committee that we're both on, but also some new ways to do infrastructure. Again, the key is finding what you can agree on. And I hadn't really heard that Emerson quote until I heard it tonight from you, but it was so right. In a partisan environment, particularly when you've got long-term, in most cases, heavily grounded political figures like you have in the Senate and at the leadership level, always in the House, you don't make much gain by talking about what you disagree on and assuming you're going to convince them to change a lifetime of a position they've developed. But you look, as Emerson suggested, for the things you do agree on, even if it starts with "it's a great day," and talk about, as Sharon mentioned, the history of the country, the bonds we have and the job we have with people who've had it before, some unique thing about your 2 states that that bring the 2 of you together. So I think it's based on that effort to get, and not agree on everything, but to find the one thing you do agree on and figure out how to move forward with that one thing.
You mentioned earlier your farewell speech on the floor of the Senate, and I want to go to that in a minute. But before I do, I want to ask you about one more relationship, and that's your relationship with Senator Ted Kennedy.
Well, it actually was a pretty strong relationship. Abby and I had a house in Georgetown where President Kennedy lived when he was a member of the House. I think he lived there for 6 years. And one night we asked Eunice Shriver and Sarge Shriver to come over, and they did. And Eunice hadn't been in that house since 1954, since 1952. And she told us stories about the house and people who had been there, and we became close. And before that, I'd introduced a piece of legislation with Steny Hoyer to add something called Healthy Athletes to Special Olympics. It was the only federal part of Special Olympics at that time, and still is. Basically, the Special Olympics is almost all privately supported. It's something I've spent quite a bit of time on. But we added something called Healthy Athletes to that. It was a bond to, the Shriver family. The house was kind of a bond to the Kennedy family. And interestingly, after they were over that night, Steve, I saw Senator Kennedy the next day walking through the Capitol, and he said, my sister called and told me what a great time they had at your house last night. And then Patrick Kennedy, who I served with in the House, within 48 hours said, my Aunt Eunice told me what a great time they had visiting with you at your house the other night. And that bond grew. When their sister Rosemary died, I introduced a resolution about Rosemary's impact on the commitment of the family for people that had special needs in the House, and it then passed the Senate. And we were able to find, Senator Kennedy and I were also able to find some healthcare related things to work on. And again, there's an individual in a family whose political experience would lead them to believe that reaching out is better than holding on to just what you have and to try to find new partners.
So in your farewell speech, you said finding someone on the other side of the aisle to work with is the best way forward. Can just briefly you elaborate on that?
Well, I would. I'd even, just to raise some controversy, probably with people who always think the Senate rules are a terrible problem. I think the Senate rules, maybe not the rule that we talk about of ending debate, but the rule that really requires you almost to find somebody from the other side. There've never been 60 popularly elected Republicans, and only a couple of times have there been enough popularly elected Democrats that the Senate could just do whatever it wanted to do. So unlike the House, and I was in the House 14 years, I was the whip, the Republican whip, and the majority whip. Most of the time I was in the House, the person that finds the votes and brings people together to pass the legislation you're trying to get done. But in the House has changed a number of times in the lifetime of everybody there, in the recent lifetime of everybody there. And you'll notice that one House will pass a lot of bills that never become law. The next group that comes in reverses that and passes other bills that will never become law. But when you find enough senators to come together, and hopefully House members too, come together and pass a bipartisan bill, not only does it become law, but it usually becomes a law that stands the test of time. It's hard to find a law that people pass that the new group was able to come in and reverse in any dramatic way. But if you look at bills that pass in the House particularly, one group passes a bunch of bills that head in one direction, and the next group comes in and passes a bill that head in another direction, and neither of them are perhaps the direction the country really wants to go in. One of the advantages of the Senate in the unique structure of our government was that even if there is a movement in the country in one direction, it takes 4 or sometimes 6 years, it's always 6 years, before every senator has had to face that movement on election day. And frankly, usually by the time you get a couple of years down the road, people have begun to think, well, maybe that was a little further than we should go right now. And the mood changes quicker than the Senate changes. And that's probably one of the real advantages of the Senate.
So I saw a quote from Senator Stabenow. I don't think it made it into the video, but she said, Roy brings people together rather than pushing them into their corners. How do you how do you avoid the problem of the rhetoric escalating to such a point that not only is there difficulty in reaching agreement, but people tend to go back to their corners and just fight it out rather than try to resolve an issue?
Well, rhetoric is clearly a problem in the country now, and people's insistence on their own facts is clearly a problem in the country now. Back when I watched the opening scenes that you showed this evening, as I got to watch them from here, I'm thinking, well, who would want to retire from something like that? Who would want to leave a job where that's the thing every day? I think part of this is in a democracy, realizing that nobody gets exactly what they want. It's interesting to me, Steve, I think really first time it became predominant in my view, at least in recent history, was in 2009, sort of the Tea Party movement after the Obama election, and more candidates office began to talk about what they'd never do as opposed to what they wanted to do. And, saying things like, if I don't get exactly what I'm telling you that I'm for, I won't settle for anything less, has so many problems. One is it means you're almost certainly not going to get exactly what you're for, which means you're out of the discussion. And I'm not sure how much of that sort of angry rhetoric is real. I wonder about the candidate who says, if I don't get exactly what I'm for, I'm not going to settle for anything less. I wonder what they're like at home. What they like at school. What do they like at work? That's just not, it's not a legitimate way to approach problems. And particularly in a democracy, frankly, if you get everything you want everywhere you are, there must be something wrong with you. Nobody is that smart or that brilliant or that persuasive that without really having some huge personality flaw, they're insisting on everything they want everywhere they are. And moving away from that, I told a couple of candidates last year who were running, not necessarily for my job, but others who come to say, well, do you have any advice? And my advice was, first of all, think about why you're running and what you want to do in the Congress and the House or the Senate. And don't do a lot of things that make it impossible in the campaign. Don't do a lot of things that make it impossible for you to be the kind of person, the kind of member that you decided you want to be. Don't take yourself out of the great debate of the country because you're so stuck to one set of ideas or facts, which is another topic, by the way. People now routinely, and somebody's already mentioned this evening, people now routinely come to every discussion with their own facts. It hasn't been that long ago, I think it's often cited, Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Well, in the world today, you can find about any set of facts you want. The very diversified media allows people to get deeper and deeper into the corners they're inclined to be in. One of my colleagues told me last year, we talked about this one day, and he said, when we got here, and I got to the House and the Senate both at the same time, he said, when we got here, people used to say to me, well, I don't agree with that decision, but you know a lot more about this than I do. He said, I can't remember now the last time anybody said to me, you know a lot more about this than I do. Everybody, again, has their own set of facts. And if we could ever agree to the facts, we could solve more problems than the moment we find ourselves in right now.
That is sort of a segue into something I wanted to ask you about. Is I have this notion that I call the risk of assumptions. And I want to ask you if you, and not just in the government or in the Senate, but in the world that you see today or in our country, this notion that, oh, she's from the Midwest, and therefore fill in the blank. Or he's a Republican, therefore fill in the blank. Or he has a college education, and we'll fill in the blank. Do you see that? And if you do you see that as an impediment to civil discourse and finding common ground when people make those kinds of assumptions?
Well, yes, but I'm not sure how unique or new that is. You know, our politics have never been as docile or as friendly as currently people would like to see that they were. And I'm a frustrated history teacher and love the history of the country, but occasionally you'll see the first, I had a chance to chair both of the last inaugurations, thinking about the transitions in the country and the importance of that moment. One was the Trump inauguration, one was the Biden inauguration, very different people, very different circumstances. The second, for many reasons, one COVID, one January the 6th. The 1800 election between John Adams, the president, and the vice president, Thomas Jefferson, still considered maybe the most personally brutal election we had in the history of the country. Occasionally, if you're a political reader, you read about thinking about what happened, what's going to happen next time. You'll still say this could be as bad as the election of 1800 or the period after the Civil War. I've read a book lately, The Age of Acrimony, about that 30 years from 1865 to the end of that century. Between 1865 and 1901, 3 presidents were assassinated. Lincoln, Garfield, and in 1901, McKinley. And the volatility of that period is great. The increased participation politically of that period is also great, but the guardrails of people having confidence in the election was not so great.
So I think it was Jefferson's inaugural address in 1801, where he said to the effect, we need to remember that we can compromise our positions without compromising our principles. And I've always thought that was a great way to think about the legislative process and the way the founders thought it was supposed to work. But enough about me.
Transition there, Steve, is also so important. Washington believed that the inauguration of his successor would be more important than his inauguration. When you think about that, and it's not hard to figure out, that's a very perceptive thing. But why would the first president think the inauguration of the next president would be more important than his? Lots of people have taken over governments with good intentions, but seldom did they give that government willingly to anybody else. And as it turned out, the Washington-Adams transition was pretty simple, and thank God Washington left on his own rather than creating some precedent that you should be president forever. But the Adams-Jefferson transition is really probably the first time in history that one group willingly gave up control of a government to a group that they thought would handle the government dramatically differently than they did. And like most things in American politics, the change is never quite as dramatic as you think it, as you're acting like it might be, or in retrospect, you assume it was. But that's such an important moment, and being able to pass the reins of government to someone else is one of the great lessons that since 1789, we have performed every 4 years for the world.
I want to leave time for questions from the audience, and we have a few up here. But just a couple of quick things I wanted to touch on. In your farewell address in the Senate, you said, "What we do here is more important than who we are." And then you told the story of the unknown cleric. Would you tell us that story?
So when I became the chief deputy whip, this is in my very second session of the Congress, the former chief deputy whip had just become the Speaker of the House, and so amazingly, 2 years after I joined the Congress, I took his job in the leadership. When I went to my office in the Capitol, moved from the floor away from the Capitol in the Cannon Building, as you could be, to the Capitol. There was this bust on top of the bookcases in my office, and after I'd been there a couple of days, I asked somebody on my staff, find out who that is, and they came back and said, "Well, nobody knows who it is." And I said, "No, it's true. Somebody has to know who it is. Find out. See if you can find out a little more." So a day or two later, they brought in a newspaper clipping from the 1930s that referred to this bust as the unknown cleric. And you get it down and look at it, clearly a cleric, but that's the only thing anybody knew about it. Couldn't have, because of the hairstyle and other things, and the age of the Capitol, it couldn't have gone into the Capitol much before 1830. And by 1930, nobody knew who it was. I've told this story a lot to members, particularly freshman Republicans, when I was the whip. And I think the point I've tried to make with that story is what we do here is more important than who we are. And if you could stay focused on what we do, you'll be much happier than if you stayed focused on who you are or who the other people you work with are. And, you know, great, somebody so important that somebody thought they'd make a bust of them and put them in the United States Capitol. And with 100 years, nobody knew. And then people would, by the way, try to guess. And I said, you understand, you can't guess because nobody knows. It's totally lost. And you could guess who you think it might be, but it's a bust not based on a photograph. It's a bust of somebody, and nobody knows who it is, but we do know it's in the capital of the United States of America.
So I have one more that I'm going to ask you, and then we're going to go to some audience questions, and then I'll come back for a couple of wrap-up questions. In your career in the House and Senate in particular, those two bodies, you had a lot of town halls, you had a lot of one-on-ones, you had encounters with protesters on different issues. In those situations, how do you prevent the rhetoric from escalating to an unacceptable level? And if it gets there, how do you try to diffuse that?
Well, I think that's probably very situational. You know, depending on what's happened to get you to that point, you really try not to let any discussion ever get to that point. And part of how you do that is you listen. You know, it's really hard for political people to listen. They're not, as everybody's heard me talk here all evening, this evening, you're beginning to perceive that maybe. But I think showing some willingness to listen, and in fact, listening. One of my favorite stories about the Senate listener, Mike Enzi from Wyoming, a CPA who, after being a local mayor in Gillette, Wyoming, came to the Senate and had a great Senate career. He would occasionally joke that he was an extroverted CPA, which meant he looked at the toes of the other guy's shoes while he was talking instead of his shoes. But most interestingly, he'd have listening sessions where he would sit on the stage and listen and take notes the whole time. And my understanding is that if he ever responded, it was later, but he was there to listen. He didn't respond to everybody, and they had root beer floats at the end of those Wyoming listening sessions. But it truly was exactly that. Now, that may be a little further than I'd have the capacity to go, but I think you can get a long way by listening. And then we did give some thought to the reason you're having that opportunity and how you've created a forum where you're actually going to learn something rather than just create another forum where two people can push each other around in the aisle, even if it's not you.
Related question, and this is one from the audience. How do you find common ground when someone attacks or tries to dehumanize you? I know you've experienced personal attacks in your career. I don't imagine there's a member who has.
Death threats and all sorts of other things. It's challenging when, going back to your earlier comments, Steve, people assume they know so much about you when they really don't know much about you at all. You know, our political parties used to be perceived to be a little more expansive than they are now, and so people would spend a little more time thinking, well, what kind of Democrat is that person, or what kind of Republican is she, what kind of Democrat is he, vice versa. I think right now that, one, because first of all, everybody has their own facts, and they just apply those facts to a label, and that creates a real challenge, and I hope we can move beyond that.
Another audience question. In recent years, working across the aisle has become a liability in many primaries. How do you combat the increasing polarization that results in?
Well, I think it is a problem, and I'm not sure you could have exactly the career that I've had if you started today. Local media was much more prevalent, and you know, in the 1970s and the 1980s, it was still the only place to get a lot of your news, and the national media was fairly restricted, and that's kind of all gone away to where more personalized, more diversified media. My politics has always been very much based on what I'd call the performance standard. Back to your work as a county official, my work as an election authority, as Secretary of State. Tell people what you're going to do and then show them how you did it. That was easier to do when you had a vigorous, with a more balanced local media. Even when I went to the Congress 26 years ago, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch had 11 reporters in their Washington bureau, 11, in that one newspaper. The Kansas City Star had 9. The Springfield paper, my hometown, the third biggest city in our state at the time, had 1 and always 2. And then there was an AP reporter or 2 that covered a couple of Midwestern states and so on and so forth. So you had like 21 people who, if they could find something you did wrong, that had to be wonderful to be able to have that kind of post-Woodward and Bernstein reporting. But they had a lot of space to fill, and they would also report on just simply what you were doing. And even if they didn't necessarily think that was a good thing, the people you worked for continue to get a sense of what you were doing. And you know, the performance standard served our country pretty well. I think now too much of both the political rhetoric and political persona has shifted more into the performative standard of how angry you can be, or even how angry you can appear to be, as opposed to how you're doing your job. And I don't know how, you know, when I was a county official, again, in Springfield, in the county of a couple 100,000 now, every morning, 4 radio reporters would come by my office, somebody from the daily newspaper, usually 2 of the 3 local television stations, and about 3 times a week, I had enough diversity in that job, I'd have something to talk about. And television at least once a week. At that point, the county clerk and election authority and the sheriff got the most local attention, but that went well beyond the boundaries of one county and allowed me to develop a sense of relationship to people of somebody who you actually might hire for this job. That served me pretty well, as opposed to somebody who says, if you send me up there, I will give them a bad time every day. I'm never going to settle for anything less than I'm for. I think we'll break out of that standard of politics, but right now it is too much the same.
Here's a tough one from the audience. On Monday, Senator Ossoff said at Georgetown, quote, "The central challenges that we face must be defined through a definition of shared interest. What 2 or 3 issues or interests should we work on first? Which issues would foster the most constructive dialogue?" There's a big paycheck out there someplace if you can answer that one.
Former Senator Isaacson's son, John, was in to see me today and talking about the naming of the VA Center in Atlanta for Johnny Isaacson, a well-deserved naming. And I said, well, that's something that Senator Ossoff and I were the principal sponsors of. So just another example of finding something you could agree with, and then we worked on something else after that. It depends on your view of the level of government and the federal government. The federal government shouldn't do everything and won't do everything very well. So, what are the needs of the time? What can the federal government do that nobody else can do? There's general view, though challenged by some now, that we can't collectively defend, we can't individually or by states defend the country. So I continue to see that as the preeminent responsibility of the federal government, whether it's cyber defense or other kinds of defense or intelligence defense. I'm on committees that related to all of that. The economic ability to the interstate commerce ability. More and more, the federal government has become an indispensable part of healthcare delivery and health research. Those are just 3 things, but asking the federal government to figure out the national priorities and how the federal government can solve them may not always be the best way to move forward on meeting those challenges.
In fact, I think you said one time that if you want to find the best solution to a governmental problem, the county courthouse is the place to go.
I don't think I said the best solution, but I did say if you want to get a problem solved, there's no better place to go than the county courthouse, particularly a courthouse full of locally elected officials who like their job, ran for their job. If you go to a courthouse anywhere in America, a local courthouse, not necessarily a federal courthouse or even a civil courthouse, but a courthouse where the local recorder of deeds and the county election authority and the assessor, if there's a way to solve your problem, they are going to find the way to solve your problem. And if there's not a way to solve your problem, they're going to do everything they can to explain to you why this problem can't be solved the way you want it solved. At the same time, too, if you want to get the sidewalk fixed in front of your house, you do not want the federal government any more involved in that, or even the state government, than they absolutely have to be if you really want to get the sidewalk fixed in any reasonable time frame.
Roy, has the role of the Secretary of State at the state level, has that changed significantly from when you were the Secretary of State, or does it just seem that way in light of the recent controversies about the election, the most recent presidential election?
Well, states differ, and all but about 3 states, the Secretary of State is the chief election official. In our state, there you are at the library, after the state library became part of the Secretary of State's office. while I was there. The Wolfner Library for the Blind, the Securities Commissioner worked for me. We had about 12 divisions in that job. But back to your question, I actually think that in many ways, the long time responsibilities for elections that most secretaries of state had suddenly became much more important in people's minds. I think there's been kind of an elevation of that job as to how important it is, who holds that job, and how they do it. The same for local county officials. I never thought county clerk, even county clerk in election was the greatest title. We should have had more title inflation, because in many ways that person is the county administrator in most small counties. So everybody, and should have had maybe more inflation there, but when you see the county clerk of Maricopa County, Arizona, explaining what their office is doing to ensure the integrity of the elections, suddenly that seems like a lot more important job to people. So I would say the job of election authorities, both local and state, has elevated itself in people's sense of how important it is. That may change who runs for those offices. It may change how people view the accountability of those offices. But we need to get back to where people have more confidence in the election, and election authorities themselves are an important part of trying to create that level of confidence and competence. And, you know, again, as first Republican to have a job in the state that was almost totally Democratic, I don't recall really ever having a problem. I worked closely with local newspapers and others to be sure people had their information, and getting the results to people in a prompt way is important. I think that's one of the challenges today of places that are continuing to count votes 2 weeks after election day and can't create a result in a way that people have confidence in. But I think those jobs have gone up in people's attitude, if not in responsibility.
We had a lot of great questions from the audience, and I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to get to all of them because I want to be respectful of your time, Roy. We've already gone over. But a couple of things I wanted to touch on before we close. As you know, my mother, in her entire life, never voted for a Republican. But she did come.
I get the point there. Is there a but?
But she did come to like and respect you very much. And I know that you had a hope that you would be the one to break the record. But she passed away 12 years ago with her record intact.
Well, she missed several opportunities to vote. So the one woman her family ran a local newspaper, and it was our papers used to designate by party, and it was a Democratic newspaper. And largely that was for legal notices and other things. But she was a blunt, not necessarily related to me in any way we could prove. But I said to her one day, I said, now, don't you think being a blunt would be enough if you could vote for one Republican one time? She looked at me and regretfully shook her head and said, no, I don't think that's enough to do something like that.
So one last thing, Roy. Could you tell the audience here and online, who is Cori Bush?
Well, Cori Bush is the congresswoman from the 1st District in Missouri, which would be largely St. Louis City, a little of the county outside the city. And she was elected, re-elected last time. So elected 2 years ago and re-elected in November. And she is serving her 2nd term. And we were able to find several things to do together. I think maybe the story you're headed toward is Cori Bush after the Trump election in what was generally called the resistance. Everybody forgets the resistance, which was not necessarily election deniers, just resistance. And it was pretty broad spread. And people would demonstrate at my offices often, but Cori Bush would come and camp out at my office in St. Louis on the steps.
And that was before she was in Congress.
Before she was elected to Congress. And when she did get elected to Congress, the first thing I did within the first week she was there was told my chief of staff, Stacey McBride, let's go over to Cori Bush's office and get to know her a little better. And so I called, said I said, call them and tell them we're on the way over, just so they know we're coming, and if they can have a few minutes, that would be great. Or maybe I said call and see if they've got a minute if we come over. And we sat down, and I said, I thought I'd come and see where your office was, because I know you know where my office is, since you used to protest there all the time. And let's see what we can figure out how to do together. And we did several, remember, we got $20 million in the last budget at the end of last year for some new metro equipment that they needed in the metro system in St. Louis, and had worked on some walking trails and other infrastructure, and just found some ways to do things together.
Here's what she said about that meeting. The fact that the senior senator from our state would reach out to me to collaborate, despite our many policy disagreements, showed me he had an interest in working together on issues where we do agree. And to me, that is a great story from a member of the squad, very progressive member of the House, as to what can happen if there is a respectful exchange and working together to get things done based on finding the common ground. Roy, I thank you so much for tonight, for taking extra time, and it's been a real pleasure, and thank you for your service and for your continued pursuit of finding common ground. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Steve. Great to be with you. I hope Diane was there tonight or gets a chance to watch this. You're great friends. Abby and I appreciate both of you, and glad for the opportunity we've had to do things together over time, and particularly for the chance to be with you at the Westport Library tonight.
Thank you, Roy.
Thank you to everyone who joined us tonight for the kickoff event of the Common Ground Initiative. My name is Mia Bombach. I am a sophomore at Staples High School in Westport and one of 2 high school students on the Common Ground Initiative Committee. We at Common Ground are thrilled to have had Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri and Mr. Steve Parrish share their insights on how we can work together to create a more respectful and engaged society here tonight. Something Senator Blunt said that really stuck out to me was he said that in a Congress of 48 Democrats and 52 Republicans, Senator Blunt, a Republican himself, was a principal sponsor on bills passed by 44 Democrats. That is what Common Ground is all about, putting aside party to prioritize policy. Tonight's event marks the beginning of an important conversation and milestone. Now more than ever, in today's divisive political climate, it is imperative that we work together over the coming months to foster a comfortable place for uncomfortable conversation. As the former news editor for Inklings, the Staples newspaper, I have seen firsthand the deteriorating effects of an inability to communicate openly and safely on our society. For our October 2022 issue, we covered the banning of books from Staples High School Library. One of our writers, while attending and photographing a Board of Ed meeting on the subject, was verbally attacked by a community member who did not share the general viewpoint of our publication. It was at this moment when I realized the importance of maintaining civility in the face of complex controversies and finding common ground despite differences of opinion. Only by coming together to tackle challenging issues and encouraging constructive dialogue can we build a stronger, more united community. We would like to extend a special thanks to the Westport Library for their support in bringing this initiative to fruition. We look forward to working together to continue promoting productive conversations and respectful engagement within our community. Tonight is just the start of something amazing. Please stay tuned for updates on future events in the Common Ground series. We hope to see you all again soon. Thank you and have a great evening. I will now hand it off to Spencer.
Thank you, Steve. Great to be with you. I hope Diane was there tonight or gets a chance to watch this. You're great friends. Abby and I appreciate both of you. And Thanks so much, Mia, and really, what an amazing evening it is. Good evening to all of you. Thanks so much for being here today. And I'm Spencer Yim, senior at Staples. I'm so proud to be the student representatives here for the Common Ground Committee. And we're just so thankful for Senator Blunt for taking the time tonight, not only for his service to our country, but his commitment to civil discourse, and that was really evident. We're so grateful to hear from him and learn about his experiences, but also his expertise on the topic. You know, I can't say how important it is that community discussions like this one are, not only for our country, but for future generations, for people that look like us, for those who are discouraged about the cancel culture, the personal attacks, the partisan nature of policy discussions. And so I've been disheartened to see that negativity, that inability to find common ground really seep in and infiltrate every place from Washington, D.C. to unfortunately even our own community of Westport. And even as students at Staples High School, I can find that we can't seem to agree to disagree or even to just disagree without being disagreeable. You know, I love what the senator said about his friendships with other senators. That was really great. And no one doubts that we're at a crossroads as a nation together, and we're so divided. But in this time of division, there's never been a bigger opportunity to work together for change. And so as I look out into the crowd, I see all of you, neighbors, friends, students, teachers, Republicans, Democrats, independents, people from all walks of life. And importantly, most importantly, I see a community. I see a community that has the ability to be an example for what it means to have civil discourse, where all people can strive to bridge the gaps and bring people together. As Mia said, tonight is just the beginning. We're gonna have more events, more speakers, more opportunities for our Westport community to grow. But it starts with us. It starts with every single person here because we all play a role in creating a more compassionate society. It starts with listening. You know, that's hard for a lot of us, but it starts with listening. It starts with being open to perspectives. And it starts by approaching every conversation with an open mind and a willingness to learn. So as young people here tonight, we know that together we can make a difference. Together, starting right here in Westport, all the way up to Washington, D.C., we can make sure that every single person has an opportunity to have their voice heard. We can return to what it truly means to be a democracy, one that is open, one that is grounded in respect and rooted in civil discourse. So from all of us at the Common Ground Initiative, we can't wait to see the impact that the Westport community has. We can't wait to see you at our next event. So thank you. Have a great evening, everyone. Thanks for coming.